All right, you ready for Jonah 2? We left off with Jonah hurled into the sea, presumably to his death. The wind and the waves now quiet. Sailors from the nations are worshiping the Lord. But in verse 17 of Jonah 1, or as I mentioned, there's a bit of disagreement on this because the Hebrew Bible actually has this as the first verse in chapter 2, because the scene totally shifts to the water, where Jonah is apparently not dead. So just imagine being in Jonah's shoes now. You hit the water with a splash and are suddenly immersed in waves as they pour over you. We don't know if Jonah was able to swim. It's certainly possible that he wasn't. But regardless, at some point a panic sets in, and before long, you find yourself struggling to stay afloat and gasping for breath as you ultimately sink into what is starting to feel like a calm, quiet tomb of water all around you. Until verse 17. And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Well, that's quite a verse. The Lord, Yahweh, appointed, provided. So just note that word, maybe circle it, underline it, because we're going to see it more in the future. A great fish. Let's pause there. We're not told what type of fish this was, or really any details about the fish. Like I mentioned at the start, it may be the main character this book is known for, apart from Jonah, but it's only mentioned almost in passing in 3 verses, which seems kind of strange to us, right? Because we're all thinking, what? A fish swallowed Jonah and kept it in its belly for 3 days? Like a little more explanation, please. We now have this picture of a man inside a digestive tract of fish intestines and fat and blubber and waste, which leads to all kinds of questions about what type of fish this is or how this would be humanly possible for a man to survive in a fish for 3 days. But here's the deal. The author of Jonah doesn't seem too focused on answering our questions. The Lord is clearly in control of this scene, including this fish that he's appointed, and the author's not trying to give us further explanation. The author accepts this is clearly a miracle. In other words, this doesn't happen every day. This was a divine act beyond human replication or explanation, so we don't need to try to explain it or imagine how to replicate it. If it happens to you, and you suddenly find yourself inside an aquatic animal, that should be your first clue that things are not in your control at that moment, and prayer would probably be a good option for you also. So God in His Word is not as interested as we are in the drama that's playing out in a fish's belly. God is interested in the drama that's playing out in Jonah's heart. And besides, think about it, God obviously could have brought Jonah back to shore another way, right? God could have provided a piece of cargo or floating wreckage that had been thrown overboard or a million other things to which Jonah could have held on to until he eventually washed up on the beach. Instead, God appoints a fish who swallows him. So circle that word because we're starting to get a clue behind why God chose this way to save Jonah. When we see this word that's used other times in the Bible, specifically to describe judgment. Look at Psalm chapter 21, verses 8 and 9 with me. Your hand will find out all your enemies. Your right hand will find out those who hate you. You will make them as a blazing oven when you appear. The Lord will swallow them up in His wrath, and fire will consume them. So this picture of a fish swallowing Jonah seems like a picture of God's judgment. At the same time, this fish is keeping Jonah alive. So it also seems like a picture of God's salvation. Remember in the last chapter, we talked about God's mercy sometimes seeming severe. The way we might describe this, and you might write it down, is salvation through judgment. So the picture here is God is showing judgment. At the same time, He's showing salvation through judgment. And that's a pretty common theme all throughout the Bible. So just one quick example from Deuteronomy chapter 4. As God's people were preparing to enter into the promised land, He says to them, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today, that you will soon utterly perish from the land that you are going over the Jordan to possess. You will not live long in it, but will be utterly destroyed. And the Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and you will be left few in number among the nations, where the Lord will drive you. And there you will serve gods of wood and stone, the work of human hands, that neither see, nor hear, nor eat, nor smell. So that's a picture of judgment. But then see the salvation that God is promising through it. Keep going in the passage. From there, you will seek the Lord your God, and you will find him, if you search after him with all your heart, with all your soul. When you are in tribulation, and all these things come upon you in the latter days, you will return to the Lord your God and obey his voice. For the Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not leave you or destroy you or forget the covenant with your fathers that he swore to them. So we'll talk more about this when we get to the takeaways from this chapter, but just remember this picture of salvation actually coming through judgment in a way that being swallowed by a fish depicts, as well as this language of being in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. So this phrase is interesting because, well, yes, it's obviously a reference to 3 days, but this phrase was also a popular way to express the journey toward death. It was almost cliche in ancient times to say that going to death was a journey of a few days, 3 days, kind of similar to how we, at least where I live in the U.S., might refer to someone being 6 feet under. I could say, man, I thought that person was 6 feet under. And that could mean literally 6 feet underground, or it could mean I thought he was dead and buried. In a similar way, this phrase, 3 days and 3 nights, would mean it's like he went to death and came back to life. And then you think about it. 3 days illustrates that picture in other places in the Bible. In Genesis chapter 22, Abraham and Isaac go on a journey for 3 days to Mount Moriah, where Isaac almost dies, but comes back alive. In Exodus chapter 15, God's people journey into the wilderness, and they don't have water for 3 days. They're about to die until God miraculously provides water for them, and they live. In 2 Kings chapter 20, Hezekiah is about to die, but he prays. God tells him he'll live, and on the 3rd day, he goes up to the temple. And in Jonah's contemporary Hosea, chapter 6, verse 1, we read, "Come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us, that he may heal us. He has struck us down, and he will bind us up. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the 3rd day, he will raise us up, that we may live before him." So this picture in Jonah that we have is helping us connect God's rescue of Jonah from death with how God brings his people from death to life. And in it, we're realizing, obviously, God did not want Jonah dead. Instead, God wanted to bring Jonah to a place where he would be alone with him and experience salvation through judgment. And it's fascinating how the author sets this up. You'll notice a period here in the middle of verse 17. That's intentional because in the original language, there's actually what's called a pausal accent right here in the middle of the verse that's intended to lead us, as the hearers of this story, to pause. The action is now dramatically slowed down. We've had Jonah running, we've had storm, we've had all these conversations. Now it's slowing down, and it's time for us to watch this encounter between Jonah and the Lord, where chapter 2, verse 1 says, "Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish." This is the first time we see this Hebrew word for pray in the story. Until now, it was just the sailors saying, "Call on your God." And if you remember, Jonah didn't do it. In fact, all throughout the first chapter of the book, not one time did Jonah say anything to God. But now, for the first time, Jonah communicates with God, setting up a pretty powerful moment in the book as he prays, verse 2, saying, "I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me." So apparently being thrown into the water had an effect on Jonah. He called out, same word that was used by the sailors in verses 6 and 14 of chapter 1. So he finally did it. He called out to God. Why now? Because he was in distress. The word means in dire straits, and the Lord answered him. Doubtless Jonah would have been familiar with these words from different Psalms. Israel's songbook, Psalm chapter 18, "In my distress I called upon the Lord. To my God I cried for help. From his temple he heard my voice, and my cry to him reached his ears." Psalm chapter 120, verse 1, "In my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me." And then, in what is pretty common in Hebrew poetry, Jonah basically repeats the same idea, but he elaborates on it with different words. So he says,
I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. And then when you get to the end of verse 2, out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. And this language is significant on a couple of levels. One, Sheol here is a reference to the abode of the dead, a place of utter, complete hopelessness from which there is no return. Job chapter 7, verse 9 says, as the cloud fades and vanishes, so he who goes down to Sheol does not come up. And it's a place of total separation from God and his goodness. Isaiah chapter 33, verse 18 says, for Sheol does not thank you. Death does not praise you. Those who go down to the pit do not hope for your faithfulness. Basically, Jonah saw himself headed not just to death, but to eternal hopelessness. And in that moment, with no breath in the Mediterranean Sea, it hit him. I don't want to go there. And Jonah knew God was his only hope for not going to Sheol. Another thing that's significant about the language here is the way Jonah refers to the belly of Sheol. It's the only time we see this phrase in the entire Bible. And just reading the English, you might think this is the same word, belly, that we see at the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2 with Jonah in the belly of the fish. But it's actually a different word here that also means womb. And here's why that's significant to know. So let's just kind of write that this word can mean womb. So now go back with me with that information to chapter 1, verse 17. You might turn back there in your notes real quick or just look at it there. The first time we see the fish mentioned, the word there for fish, the Lord appointed a great fish. The first time we see fish there, that word is a masculine noun. So used to refer to a male fish. But then in verse 1 of chapter 2, the author changes this, and when we see fish, this is actually, so we'll put an M over here for masculine, we'll put a F here for feminine, which begs the question, why the change? Well, a feminine noun would carry more maternal connotations, and paired with the womb of Sheol, later here in verse 2, the author is subtly but beautifully pointing out how Jonah was in the throes of death and hopelessness. But when he called to the Lord, much like a baby being born from a mother's womb, the Lord was making a way for Jonah to be brought to life again, to be, in a sense, reborn from death and utter hopelessness. Out of the womb, the belly of Sheol, I called to you, and you heard my voice. Which leads to verse 3, for you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Just look at this wording. Jonah attributes everything that has happened to him to God. Actually, notice that Jonah goes from talking about God in verse 2 to talking to God here in verse 3. You cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. You did this. In other words, the sailors didn't throw me off the boat. The wind and waves didn't just happen. You did this. The flood surrounded me, not of its own will. It was your waves and your billows that passed over me. This is identical language to Psalm 42, verse 7. Deep calls the deep at the roar of your waterfalls. All your breakers and all your waves have gone over me. Then in Jonah chapter 2, verse 4, Jonah says, then I said, I'm driven away from your sight, yet I shall look again upon your holy temple. Cast in the deep heart of the seas, surrounded by flood and the waves and the billows of God, Jonah concludes, I am driven away from God's sight. And the word for driven away there is the same word we see in Genesis 3:24, when after Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, remember what the Bible says? God drove out the man. And at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed the cherubim with a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. Jonah saw himself as banished from God's presence on the way to death until he looked again to God's holy temple, the place where God dwells. A powerful image and a turning point when you think about this whole story, starting with Jonah fleeing from where? From the presence of the Lord. Now he's turning toward the presence of the Lord as he's drowning, which he elaborates on more in verse 5. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped about my head. Jonah's basically describing the journey he was experiencing toward death by drowning. The waters closed in over me to take my life. As he sunk, the deep surrounded me. What imagery. Just imagine the darkness of the water circling around him as he sinks to the bottom of the sea, where seaweed wraps about his head like grave clothes for burial. Verse 6, he's at the roots of the mountains. Picture the high mountains whose bases extend all the way down to the bottom of the sea, to the ocean floor, where I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. The word for land here has the kind of sense of the underworld, a place from which he could never escape, where bars would close upon him forever, like without end. Yet you. I love this. Like, put an exclamation point, or a lot of them there. Like, yet you. One of the many places in the Bible where everything seems lost and hopeless, even forever. Yet God. But God, you brought up my life from the pit. Oh Lord, my God. You brought up the same word that Amos, Jonah's contemporary, uses, as God says, also, it was I who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Just as God brought up his people from slavery in Egypt, Jonah says, you brought up my life from the pit. And even this picture of bringing up is a major contrast from what we saw in chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2, right? Where Jonah is continually descending down, Israel, down to Joppa, down to the bottom of the ship, down to the sea, down to the deep, down to the base of the mountains. Everything Jonah has done has been downward to the lowest depths possible, to the bars of death and Sheol. But the Lord, his God, meets him there, and he brings him up from the pit, a word that also means grave. And then it continues, when my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Again, just picture Jonah drowning. He's to the point where he has no breath left in him when the Lord, and the Lord actually comes first in the Hebrew here, the Lord, I remembered. I remembered Yahweh, and my prayer came to you. And the phrase, into your holy temple, is such a powerful image. Jonah's in the midst of the depths of the earth, as far as he could possibly be from Mount Zion, the temple. But God hears Jonah's prayer. He says in verse 8, those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. The most plain reading of this verse is that Jonah is very glad he's not put his hope in vain idols at this point. The word for vain is so good. It's a combination of breath and emptiness. Jonah is saying, from the depths of an ocean floor, completely out of breath, that idols are empty and offer no hope for breath to him there. They're vain. They are idols. And the word for idols there literally means a snare. Idols are deceptive snares. They promise you so much, but when you most need them, when you're at your lowest point, they prove completely empty. Our only hopes in the depth of despair, Jonah says, is the steadfast love of the Lord. And this right here is one of the greatest words in the Old Testament. So you might write it down. It is, the way it would sound in English is hesed. Hesed. And there's really no one word in English that sums up this Hebrew word. It's like love and kindness and loyalty and faithfulness and mercy all wrapped into one. It is a beautiful word. This, Jonah says, is my only source of hope. The hesed, the love, kindness, loyalty, faithfulness, and mercy of the one true God. And in the next verse, Jonah contrasts himself with idolaters, saying, but I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you what I have vowed I will pay. Jonah says, in contrast to idolaters, I will sacrifice to you, Lord. I will pay vows to you. And then we come to the 5 English words that many would say are the theme of the entire book. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Like, mark that. The Lord saves. Salvation belongs to him, meaning the Lord is sovereign over salvation. He alone is able, and he alone has authority to save. And he saves completely. Verse 10, and the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land. This fish had apparently traveled all the way back toward Joppa. And can we just pause and point out here, amidst all we're talking about with Jonah, this was an uncomfortable 3 days for the fish. Like, not a lot of people read this book and express sympathy for the fish, but I think we should. Nobody likes a stomachache, especially one that's caused by a living organism inside you. So let's at least pause for a moment and feel a bit for the fish, who the Lord, the sovereign God over the fish, speaks to, and it vomits. And the word the author uses there is intentionally pretty disgusting. So I'll tell you what's in my mind here. And this will be a bit of an aside, but I promise not too graphic. Not long ago, I'll leave the timeline a bit general, but fairly recently, somebody had brought our family some food, and we were eating it for dinner, and it involved some chicken, and we ate it. Tasted great, and we were going to bed, and one of my children, I won't mention which one, comes to me. He's like, I'm not feeling very good, Dad. My stomach's not feeling very good. I said, oh, okay, well, let me set you up. Here's a bucket. We'll put it by your bed on a towel. If anything goes wrong, just, use the bucket. And I promise I'm not going to get this too graphic. Well, he later comes up and to my room, and he's like, Dad, I threw up. And I was like, okay, did you hit the bucket? And he's like, no, I went running past the bucket. And so it's like everywhere and all over the bathroom. I was like, buddy, that was what the bucket was for. And so I'm like, oh, it's all right. I mean, he wasn't obviously feeling good. So I get him situated back. I'm like, all right, here's the bucket. Like, use the bucket. And then I go and I start cleaning up. Heather, my wife, usually does all the hard stuff around the house. I'll just put that. But this particular, like, throw up, she just doesn't do. And so this is like my assignment. And so I'm cleaning up the bathroom, and it's a mess. And I finished doing all that, and then I go back toward my room. Well, on the way back toward my room, I see one of our other kids' rooms, and this child, who will remain unnamed also, has also experienced the same thing that the other sibling had experienced, and he's done the same thing in his room. He didn't have a bucket, and I go into the bathroom right near him, and it was like a war zone. Like, it was I've never seen anything like it. And so I'm like, okay, buddy. So I'm like cleaning him up, like Clorox wipes, like all over his body. And then in his room, then I get him set up with a bucket, and then I start cleaning the bathroom. And then it's when it hit me, because I'm not feeling good right now. And I'm like, oh no, this is making its way through the whole house. And we got 5 kids in the house. Thankfully the baby had another meal that night. So, but I know it's coming. So I get buckets. And by this time, I'm not feeling good. I'm literally crawling on my hands and knees into different rooms and waking kids, my wife, Heather, up. I'm just like, it's coming. Like, you're going to need this. So just use this when it comes. And sure enough, we all went down. So all that to say, that's the picture I have in my mind when I picture vomit here in Jonah chapter 2, verse 10. And nobody likes this. Like, nobody thinks, oh, that's a great story. I would love to have been a part of that. Like, no. Let's make sure we get the picture here, and Jonah too, because it's not pretty. Again, you put yourself in Jonah's shoes. This is a humbling scene. Like, not you vomited, you were vomited. Like, you just got spit up on shore, and you're laying there with fish vomit all over you. And that's how Jonah chapter 2 ends.